This is the supplement for week 2, assignment 1, discussing the 3 different color systems. I first want to take a moment and discuss the writing portion of this assignment. Remember, when we're looking at answering questions and participating and in the critiques, we want to move past just subjective comments and begin to use factual information so that we move toward having a supported argument. One of the cornerstones of this course is having this transition from a subjective observation to something that's fundamentally supported. And that's something we introduced last week with these RGB values, and we're going to continue this week. So let's take a look at our color systems here. Now, you'll have the traditional color wheel, which many of you are probably familiar with. And this one, in the past, we had students paint the color wheel. You're going to go ahead and give your interpretation with additive colors. As you've noticed at this point, we're working with additive colors only, although we're talking about color theory as print, and there's a lot of crossover here. So if you have questions at how the crossover works, even though we're working in the additive system, let me know. The book talks about print, but the lectures are mainly dealing with the additive system in many cases, or the assignments are dealing with additive system in many cases, but the crossover back and forth, whether this is web design or print, they're interchangeable in most cases. So let me know if you have questions about that, and we'll go into that in more detail. But for now, for the assignment, we're going to do an example here with the additive system. And your primary colors in the additive system are red, green, and blue. And we saw this with the RGB sliders. And this time I have the color window here so you can see these sliders open. Here's your tab to open this area. And red is when 255 in this area. That's fully saturated. Anytime this red is lower, it's becoming a shade. To create a tint of red, these green and blue values would have to be equal and increasing and heading towards 255. So at this point, we can go ahead and use our paint bucket tool. I have continuous unchecked, so let me check that for you. And we can fill in our red, since we know red is at the top. It's traditionally at the top of all color wheels. If for some reason you want to do something different, let me know. We can, if there's justification for why you're making a change, we can talk about it, and usually that's fine. So we can go ahead and add our primaries. So go ahead and remove the red, and then we can go ahead and add our green. And then we're going to go ahead and add our blue. Now, I'm not going to walk you through all 3 of these. I'm going to just walk you through the additive for this portion. And then basically you're going to have to learn from the lectures on how to go ahead and do the other 2. But if there are questions, post drafts, and we'll go from there. So as you saw from the lecture, though, the secondary colors are made from mixing equal parts of the primaries. So in this case, we can use our RGB values, or we can go back to HSB. I'm going to stick with the RGB values because, as I've mentioned previously, they're a little more accurate. So in the case of the secondary cyan between blue and green, we basically want even amounts of 255 for the RGB values of green and blue, and that is our cyan, and that would be a fully saturated cyan. And to go back to HSB, just to give you an indication, remember the SMB values, when they're at 100%, that's fully saturated, and the H value is 180 degrees, and that is our cyan here. So moving on to our next secondary color, we'll go ahead up here to magenta, which will be equal amounts of red and blue. So we'll remove the green, we'll do 255 of the red, and that is our magenta. And I'd like you to start to become more familiar with these HSB and RGB values. So we can see magenta is hue 300, and that would be directly between the blue, which I'll go ahead and eyedropper for you. It's hue 240 and hue 0 or 360. Either is red, and that refers to the number of degrees in a circle. If you're familiar with the geometry, it's just referring back to the circle. It's not really critical that you understand that. So let's go ahead and do our last secondary color, go back, and this will be the one between red and green. So red is at 255, green at 255. This is a little harder. You can go ahead and do it with the degrees. It makes it typically a little bit simpler. So let's go ahead and get my paint bucket tool here, fill it in there, and that would be our last secondary color. So basically now what you're looking for is to do these tertiaries. So when you're thinking between the red and the yellow, this would be 1 part red, 1 part yellow. Well, how would you get that? You could go back to HSB, which would be much easier to do. And how you could do that in HSB is this is a 12-step color wheel. So we have 360 degrees in the color wheel. Divide that by 12. The transitions are going to be 30 degrees. Very simple. In RGB, it's a little bit more difficult. We need 1 part red and basically 1 part yellow. Another way to think of that would be we need 2 parts red, 1 part green. So to get that, we would need to cut this green in half. 128 or 127.5. And if we switch this back to HSB, this should be hue 30. And that's what it is. A little more complicated that way. It works just as well. Something to think about as you go through. I'm going to leave these extra tertiary for you to work out. It's important that you start to work on these transitions on your own. I don't want to give you all the answers, but I am going to post the previous course that did this, and they did this in 24 steps, so it should be very familiar to you and helping you establish how to develop this. Also remember, what do each of these color systems create when they're entirely mixed together? We want the centers identified as well. So in essence, this assignment comes back to being about gradation of hue. Thinking about this at 360 degrees, these two are very similar. This is going to be a little bit more of your interpretation of what the traditional color wheel is, because it's not quite the same as additive color. We're using additive color to provide an interpretation of a traditional color wheel. I would like to see some comments about how you arrived at these colors. It's not essential, but when answering the questions, use some support information to justify your comments. We don't want just an opinion statement that is very subjective. We want something that's supported with a factual argument. And if you have questions about that, feel free to let me know. Feel free to take advantage of that draft area. It's there for you. And if there's anything else, let me know. Thanks.